And we're going to continue with the first chapter of The Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull. Johnny and the Professor are on a little Christmas trip in New Hampshire, but there has been a car crash. Luckily, the Professor's got his brandy and he's got his cigar. He is zoning out until the owner of the hotel that they're staying in decides to come in and strike up a conversation. And we'll pick up from where we left off. Glad to have you, said Mr. Spofford pleasantly. He leaned back and blew a stream of smoke at the mantelpiece. I see by the way you signed your name in the guest book that you're a professor, Mr. He paused and grinned apologetically at the Professor. I'm sorry, I hate to admit it, but I couldn't read your handwriting. Mine's nothing to brag about, but yours is worse. Is it Chilmark or Chillingsworth or what? The Professor glared at Mr. Spofford. His handwriting was awful, and he knew it, but he hated to have people comment on it. It is Childermass, he said stiffly. Roderick Childermass, Ph.D. Mr. Spofford looked shocked. His hand flew to his mouth, and there was an uncomfortable silence in the room. Johnny was bewildered. He glanced from one man to the other. What on earth had happened? The Professor set his brandy glass down on a table by the armchair. He stubbed out his cigarette in an ashtray and folded his hands in his lap. My dear sir, he began coldly, there are a few traitors and renegades in our family history, but on the whole, Childermass is an ancient and honorable name. There was a Childermass at the Battle of Agincourt, and another with the barons who forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. So may I ask why my name has given you such a turn? Mr. Spofford gave the Professor an embarrassed sidelong glance. Oh, it ain't nothing against you personally, or your family name. It's only just that, well, we got this clock here that we show to visitors sometimes, and it's supposed to be haunted, and, well, it's called the Childermass clock. Now it was the Professor's turn to be astonished. His mouth dropped open, and he looked positively aghast. Good Lord, he said in a slow, awestruck voice. So, that's what's become of it. At the word haunted, Johnny's eyes lit up. He had been listening to this conversation with growing interest, and now he was totally fascinated. Hey, he exclaimed, is it really haunted? And can we see it? I'd really like to. His voice trailed off. Embarrassment overcame him, and he wondered if maybe he had said something he shouldn't have. The innkeeper glanced quickly at Johnny, and then he turned back to the Professor. Do you know about this damned thing? I mean, why it was made and what it's for and everything? The Professor sighed. He picked up his brandy glass, swirled the liquid inside, and took a sip. Alas, yes, he said gloomily. I know far too much about that clock, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised to hear it was haunted. Not one bit. So it's here. Good gravy. It was stolen out of the old Childermass place. Our family home up in Vermont got broken into about 10 years ago. The Professor paused and smiled wryly at Mr. Spofford. I assume, he went on, that you wouldn't have told me about the clock if you had been the thief yourself. So would you mind telling me how in blazes it wound up here at this place? Mr. Spofford shrugged. No, I wouldn't mind telling you. It's a weird story, though. You see, it got left on the front porch here one night during a snowstorm. Next morning, my wife stuck her head out the front door, and there 'twas, with a piece of burlap sacking pulled over the top of it. No note with it or nothing. Mr. Spofford paused and stared at the fire. Somebody must have wanted to get rid of it, he added in an odd tone of voice. There was a brief silence. Johnny could hear the banjo clock ticking and the fire crackling. Suddenly Mr. Spofford leaped to his feet. Well, he said a bit too loudly, would you two like to see the darned thing? How about it? Johnny said yes, he'd love to see the clock, and the Professor agreed. They followed the innkeeper out of the parlor and around a couple of corners, and then down a wide hall that ran from the front to the back of the old building. On their left rose the staircase that led to the second floor. On their right were closed doors. Mr. Spofford opened a door at the far end of the hall, and he flipped on a light switch. Johnny and the Professor found themselves in a small, disorderly room full of broken or unused pieces of furniture. There were cane-bottomed chairs with the seats smashed out, and end tables with broken legs. Against one wall was a stout workbench with a vise clamped to one end, and next to it was a dusty library table. On the table stood the clock. It was quite large for a shelf clock, 2 feet wide and about 4 feet high. The case was made of dark, close-grained wood that shone with varnish. The upper half of the clock was a lot like the shelf and the mantel clocks that were made by the Willard brothers of Massachusetts back in the early 1800s. There was a churchy pointed roof on the top, and it was flanked by two carved wooden spires. The face of the clock was made of white painted metal with black numerals, and the hands were of curly, fancy cast bronze. Painted neatly on the face were the words M. Childermas Fecit, and the date 1889. In the bottom part of a clock of this sort, you usually saw a pendulum behind a square glass door. But in this case, what you saw was a dollhouse room. It was made to look like the parlor of a well-to-do Victorian house in the 1870s or 80s. Everything was done very carefully in miniature. When Johnny squatted down and peered into the shadow box room, he saw a red Turkish carpet on the floor and an oval antique table with a green plush cover. On the table were an oil lamp, a pair of glasses, and a Bible. Next to the table was an old-fashioned easy-chair upholstered in black leather. On the left was a fireplace with candlesticks and a mantel clock, and against the rear wall was a sideboard with two tiny wine decanters above it. Above the decanters hung an oil painting in gilt frame. A fussy, curly-backed red velvet sofa stood against the right-hand wall, and near it a door stood ajar, showing a cloak and a top hat hanging on pegs in the hallway. The wall to the left of the fireplace had a built-in bookcase, and before it stood a doll that was made to look like an old man. It had a silky gray beard, a black suit, and a black string tie. The doll appeared to be studying the bookcase, and its hand was stretched out in the act of taking a book from a shelf. Johnny and the professor squatted down with their heads close together. They peered into the room, taking in all the odd, intricate details. "Over there! Look at that!" said the professor, pointing a long tobacco-stained finger. Those things on the shelves on the left side of the fireplace. Aren't they marvelous?" Johnny looked at the row of built-in shelves. Instead of books, these shelves held objects. Teeny baskets of fruit,